Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Well, we didn't produce a podcast last week because we were busy, so busy, not to be those people that go, I'm so busy.
So busy.
But, we were busy trying to push out the results of the latest University of Texas Politics Project poll, which we did, relatively quickly, a little more quickly than we usually do. And that poll was conducted during the last week of August, right after the conclusion of the Democratic National Convention, before Labor Day, amidst all of the recent polling discussion of the what do you want to call it? The end of the Harris boom, the flattening. I think how people describe that is even kind of loaded. But
sugar high.
We were at there you go, sugar high, good one. So it's been a few days. This is our poll release podcast, and as is customary, I'm happy to be joined by my colleagues in the polling troika here at the Texas Politics Project. Daron Shaw, professor of government and co-founder of this project, of the polling project, among other honorifics and enterprises. So welcome back, DRS.
Always a pleasure to be here.
Always a pleasure to have you, sir. And, of course, Joshua Blank, research director for the Texas Politics Project, who I should say helped push out that poll in 48 hours when he was sick as a dog, which, we're going to blame on him having children because that's what happened.
We'll hit that in Parents' Corner at the end of the podcast.
Yeah, exactly. I got a long list of those.
So greetings, Josh.
Good to be here.
We also have to note, I suppose, that it is debate night as we're recording this late Tuesday morning. So, it's appropriate that we'll start with what our latest poll tells us about the state of the presidential race and almost certainly dip into the subject of the debate, briefly a little at the end. By the time most of you are hearing this, the debate has already happened.
Yeah, it might come up a little bit here and there anyway.
But yeah, I think it's pretty likely to come up. I think what a premonition. All right, so let's jump into it. Let's start off with the top line trial ballot results in the presidential race. Josh, you want to get us started?
Yeah, sure. So in both the multi-candidate trial ballot that includes Jill Stein and Chase Oliver, and in a two-way race just between Trump and Harris, Trump leads Harris 49% to 44%, so a 5-point gap. That's a slight improvement for Harris on Biden's June numbers, in which he was leading by 7, up 46-39. And I think it's important to point out real quick at the outset that any comparisons we make to June are kind of interesting in and of themselves because they occur before almost everything, right? So in the sense that, this was before the debate performance. So this is where Biden was sitting before the debate performance, before the assassination attempt, before the conventions and the replacement of Biden at the top of the ticket. And so this is where the race stood. And so just to kind of put that out there as an aside, and so Trump's, overall support increases from 46% in June to about 49%. Harris's from Biden's 39%, which is a whole question we could have if that's even the right way to do this, to where she's at 44% right now. 6% say they're undecided, which I think is just important to throw out there too. We're going to, with the debate tonight and everything that's going on, it's important to note that, most voters who intend to vote know who they intend to vote for and probably are going to vote for that person at this point.
I think that's probably
Is that
fair.
safe? Is that good? Is that too strong, Daron? I mean,
Yeah, what do you make of this, Daron?
Well, I think, we've seen a raft of national polls that have come out since, the switcheroo or the replacement or,
I'm surprised you don't have like a pithy,
Yeah, I've been workshopping a few ideas, but let's just say the emergence of Kamala Harris as the Democratic nominee. And as well as a lot of state numbers from the state, the battleground states, which is, it's interesting just as a comment, amongst polling, the polling team here. One of the criticisms in 2016 that I think was actually more on target than some of the ones about the accuracy of the polling was the paucity of polling in states that turned out to be really decisive, and most notably Michigan, right?
Yeah.
We only had I want to say half a dozen credible polls in the last month in the state of Michigan. But that's, we're not suffering from a lack of data this time around. Some of it higher quality, some of it less. This is obviously the highest quality you're going to get. But we haven't had a lot of Texas polls. Ours was, kind of one of the first out there. And so we're looking also at some of the, underneath the hood stuff, not to, we need to cover this ground. We can kind of have a conversation about it, but almost no defection. On either side, right? We've got only 4% of Democrats defecting to Donald Trump, only 4% of Republicans, defecting to Kamala Harris. We've got Harris. I think it is notable, and this has been a consistent finding, whereas Biden was losing amongst self-declared independents by 6 to 12 points, Harris seems to be winning amongst that group. Now, that's not a decisive group in Texas because of the kind of lopsided party split favoring the Republicans, but she's up 43-34 amongst independents, which is considerably better than
Trump was leading Biden 34-20 in June.
Yeah. So that's an important shift. The gender gap here is about what you see, nationally. We've got Trump up 16 points with men. We have Harris up 6 points with women. I was really interested in both the African American and Hispanic numbers. We've got Trump still polling 20% amongst African Americans, which is down a little bit from his high water mark versus Biden. But boy, I tell you, it's difficult to see Harris winning if Trump actually were to draw 20% of African Americans across battleground states.
I'll take that bet on the markets, though, personally.
Okay, and then
just to throw it out there, if you want to.
Oh no, I think that number is likely to come down.
Yeah,
I'm saying if it were to stay.
Hey, Daron, can we pause on that for just a second? Because I want to, I think we've talked about that. I think we talked about this even the last time the three of us were together, but
maybe not on the podcast though.
It does seem to be, a bit of a pattern, and I keep swearing to go back. I'm going to go back and look at this, and we still just haven't. And I have a little bit. But it seems like this is not new, and maybe the extent of it is new, but I sort of have had this discussion before where, we do a poll a few months ahead of the election and the African-American numbers tend to be higher in the polling in Republicans than they are in the final outcome.
Yes.
Now, I don't remember it being this high, but that seems to me to be a typical characteristic
That's
of
true.
Polling in Texas going into election, and to some degree even nationally.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So for instance, in the late summer, early fall polls we were doing nationally at Fox in 2020, it wasn't so much the Trump number being in the 20s or approaching 30. It was the Biden number being sort of capped at 69, 70, 75. And so a lot of that undecided vote, a lot of that I'm not sure I'm going to vote number ends up coming home for the Democrats. This time around, though, two interesting possible changes. The first is that the absolute number of voters for Trump is increased appreciably. It's not it's not 70 for Biden, 10% Trump, 20% undecided. It's closer to 70 Biden or Harris, 20 Trump, 10% undecided. So the one point is that Trump is objectively higher, so he's going to have to lose votes, right? And the secondly is the undecided is lower. The number of people kind of available to break seems a little lower. You're going to have persuasion, not simply mobilization, which is now, by the way, I do expect it to happen. I think the magic number from 2020 is 8%. That's what Trump got in the national surveys, 8% amongst African-American voters. I think kind of to Josh's point, anything south of 15 for Trump is probably good news for Harris. Right. Anything north of 15 is going to cause some angst, right? That I think is that's so for listeners out there, I think that's kind of the benchmark.
Because that's what I recall. It's not unusual looking back over our past polling in the state and looking back over, to see Trump or to see a Republican candidate, in the 12 to 15, 16% range in, among African Americans, and then, people that want to, I don't know, rag on the poll or rag on polling or whatever go, oh, I'd bet the farm that's not going to be what it looks like. And it's like, well, okay.
And usually it's the inverse that people start to point out first, which is say, oh, so the Democrats only going to get 75%. And it's like, and I think a lot of this does come down, again, we talk a lot about, we'll see if we talk about it today, but, this does come down to where likely voter surveys, screens are pretty helpful. Right. I mean, to the extent that there were discussions that I think were very premature and in many cases wrong, in the spring about African-American voters and especially, young African-American men who were interviewing how many in a 1,000-person survey, 20, 15. There's a lot of variance around those numbers. Right. And so this idea that, and I think this is, I've looked at this data a little bit with some of our stuff going back, but I have to go back and look at it a little bit more closely. But, to the extent that Trump is pulling from less democratically attached African Americans and just generally less politically engaged and younger African Americans, it's like, hey, go with God. Good luck with that. That's not really a major electoral group for the most part. And those are the sort of people that we would expect to really fall off when we start really starting to screen, when we start to really look for who the actual electorate is going to be. And then I think that number is going to be more. To Daron's point, Daron's not wrong, right? I mean, the difference between 10 for the Republican and 20 undecided versus, 20 for the Republican and 10 undecided definitely matters. But I think in close elections, it matters. But just to put some math on this, right? I mean, even in a state with a large African-American population, you're talking about a percentage point.
Take Georgia.
Yeah, percentage. Take Georgia. 2 percentage points.
Georgia, you're talking about 30% of the electorate is going to be African-American.
Right.
Right. So if you're talking about,
so 3 points.
Right, exactly. Which is, an electorate of 6 million, that's tens of thousands of votes. Right. That's decisive in a place like that. There's also
a place where Georgia that's going to be close.
Right, right, exactly. You're only talking about probably a 25 to 10,000 vote spread one way or the other to begin with. The other thing is it presents targeting issues for the if traditionally Democrats can simply target African American communities, knowing that the yield is going to be 9-1, right? For every 10 African American voters I register and mobilize, I'm probably going to get 90% of those, right? If it's 8-2, well, that's a different math. It not only your yield is less, which means you have to mobilize more to net a sufficient number of voters in those communities to meet your targets. And I don't want to bog down too much, but I think that's a fairly simple kind of way to think of it.
Yeah.
So anyway, I interrupted you. So you were going through groups.
Well, that was interesting. How about Hispanics?
But it was a good one. Yeah. Let's move on to something simpler.
Yeah, exactly. And we find, and Josh can kind of fill in the back on this. It was 43 for Trump, 45
for Biden.
For Biden.
I'm sorry, for Harris. Whoa.
For Harris. Yeah. And then 13% either other. I think it was 8% other and 5% undecided. So, and that's a high number for our groups, but it's not unusual. Hispanic voters in Texas tend to have slightly higher levels of undecideds than other groups, right? But this isn't unusual given our polling. I would again expect a lot of that undecided vote probably to break for Harris, but can she get to the kinds of numbers? And later on, we talk about Allred. Can they get Democratic candidates get to the kind of numbers to make this thing a contest?
Yeah, and I think the answer is going to be no. I'm sorry, but I'm just looking at the numbers, and I mean, this is one of those things where we've been saying this for years, and I can't go back on it now, right? Which is to say,
sunk costs.
Well, as someone who says a lot of things about politics, you have to eat some stuff sometimes.
You buy that stock, you got to hold it.
Yeah, well, sometimes you can forget about it at least, but in penny stocks. But in this case, we've been saying for a long time that, for Democrats to be competitive here, if their strategy relies on mobilizing a lot of Hispanic voters, then they're going to need to get, probably in the neighborhood of 60, let's just say 60 to 65% of that vote. Yeah. And they're just not even close. And it's not even that they're not even close, but I think, the more we've looked at the data, at least for me, and I'm just kind of jumping out on a limb here over time, I would say Republicans in the state have really solidified their minority of support among Hispanics in a way that puts a bulwark there that looks closer to be right at that 40 and is bumping up to 45 pretty regularly.
Josh, I've talked with some friends of mine who are on the Republican and the Democratic side who are watching the registration numbers in South Texas. And this is a problem for the Democrats.
Yeah.
The registration. Now you don't register by party. But, if you look at the modeled party, which is highly dependent on participation in the primaries, you look at primary turnout on the Republican side. Now, you could argue there was no real contest on the Democratic side, but that's not true because there was a Senate race. If you look at the primary participation numbers, as James Carville said famously, about the Virginia results in 2016 as auguring bad for Hillary, that ain't good.
Look, I mean,
I think that's the problem with the numbers we're seeing right now.
Having been here for a while, I know what the Republicans are doing to increase their numbers and their margins among Hispanics. It's very clear and it's very targeted. And in some ways, the challenge is a little bit, I think, in some ways it's actually easier here because really what you're targeting in a lot of cases is rural Hispanics who are just happen to be, who happen to be Hispanic. They're also just, rural voters who are overwhelmingly Republican. What the Democrats are doing here, I cannot really say with any serious confidence. And part of that is the targeting piece of this, which is that, if you're Democrats and you're just targeting, people overall in cities and suburbs, and you're looking at, all the data that you can to parse that out. It's also the case that there are people that they're targeting in these suburbs who happen to be Hispanic. But in terms of the story and sort of how people think about it, it's changing, I think, in a lot of ways before our eyes. And it's not going to be, I mean, right now it doesn't look like the Democrats are going to ride a Hispanic wave to victory anytime soon.
This is something that, Professor David Leal has talked about here about, as the Latino middle class, develops in Texas and places like San Antonio and Austin and Houston, as the population diversifies economically, it's going to diversify politically. And I think that's something that people who assume demography is destiny have probably overplayed. I mean, you look at the issues right now that Republicans are using for micro-targeting. It's guns, it's abortion, it's a set of issues where—
economy.
You're right, the economy, economic opportunity, regulation, anti-Green New Deal, all this stuff. It doesn't necessarily work with broad populations, but it works with a segment of the Hispanic population. And I'm not quite sure, Josh, to kind of back up what you're saying, I'm not quite sure what the Democrats are doing on that front. They're doing a little bit of abortion targeting with younger Hispanic voters. But as we were saying, I mean, that's a slender reed to kind of hang your hopes on, an election like this.
Yeah, and I mean, this gets into a broader conversation about how, other people have written about this and talked about this, about how Democrats have misread the room kind of in the context of Trump in such a way that, I think has led— you can see this in the Democratic convention, kind of the response in some ways, which has led them towards a lot of policies that honestly don't speak to these concerns. They don't speak to these kind of bread and butter economic safety concerns. And so when you're talking about, again, this is where we're talking about, let's say, DEI in the schools, you're talking about gender stuff. You are actually bumping up against a population that leans traditional, that leans in that direction. And it's sort of like, what are you guys talking about? And you can see that in the open-ended questions when you say, what should they be talking about? The economy, the border, these fundamental issues.
And I should clarify, when I say guns, I'm not talking about gun violence or school shootings. I'm talking about gun ownership rights, and especially as Josh was sort of suggesting with rural Hispanics. This is an issue that, resonates. And you think about the history of a lot of, especially first-generation people come from Mexico for whom, where gun ownership is banned, individual-level gun ownership is banned. Coming to the United States and being able to purchase a gun to protect your family is a big thing in a lot of places in rural Texas.
And I just think there's to the point kind of lurking here is, what are the determinants of these political attitudes, in a sense, or, and I think there's that question of, I think you can't overemphasize the rural focus and that being where the action is here, even if it's not where there are tons of votes. It's still, Republicans are fishing where, they're a fish.
The micro part of micro-targeting.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And again, to the bigger picture, looking at the margins we have here, it's a pretty good strategy given that, I don't know what Republican or what Democrats are doing either per se. I mean, in terms of Hispanic targeting, I know that there's been some ad purchases in Spanish language.
Cool.
And some,
No,
look,
I know. I'm sorry. I'm not the
you can be dismissive of that, but I mean, depending on where, look, that's probably where there are more likely Democratic voters.
Yeah.
To do that. But I also think it's, I agree with you to the extent that, that sounds a little like, the 1990s called and they want their mobilization tactic back. Given, kind of like the Leal arguments and the kind of stuff that David talks about, given the increasing differentiation of the Hispanic population, a lot of the places, I think in a lot of the places, particularly actually among urban Hispanics, where you're going to find more Republican success are in households where Spanish is not the primary language.
Jim, it's a good point talking about urban too, because I was surprising. I may not have. I focused on the rural and suburban numbers typically when I look at these. And sometimes I ignore the urban. I would encourage our listeners to take a look at the urban numbers because the urban numbers are very competitive in Texas. I mean, we all know that that's where Democrats get their votes, but the split in the urban areas. What do we have, Josh? I want to say it was
48-45.
48-45. So about a +3 Democratic split. I mean, that's quite different than you'll see in the battleground states where Democrats dominate in those urban areas, right? And I'm not suggesting they're not going to win in Dallas or Houston.
They'll expand that probably.
Right, exactly. But those are numbers that the Democrats need to improve on.
And I think, one of the things that's overhanging this, and if I can jump to something that I think is sort of important, is that, a lot of the focus sort of, again, in sort of the wake of the last number of months and everything has been on the impact that Harris's entrance into the race has had, and essentially had on Democratic attitudes, had on attitudes towards the presidential ticket, all these things. But one of the things that sort of struck me in the poll, we didn't really highlight it that much, but I think it's all, maybe equally important is, the Republicans also had a convention this summer, right? Donald Trump survived an assassination attempt in a way that really, galvanized his base. Now, he was already at such a high point anyway. It wasn't like Harris who had a lot of room to grow with Democrats. Trump didn't have a lot of room to grow with Republicans. But nonetheless, when we look at the favorability ratings for Trump in this poll among Republicans, 88% said they had a favorable view of him. That's the highest ever recorded over 24 surveys going back to November of 2015. 62% very favorable, also high. That is clearly, a reflection of the events, but also, and this is the other thing, part of this has been such a focus on the Democratic Party because they were in such disarray in some ways, because of Biden. The Republicans have also come home, and we were talking about this before the podcast, right? Republicans have also taken the summer, had the convention, showing up in the fall, and, Trump's numbers did go up, right, among a lot of groups. And so I think that's kind of what you're seeing. And some of this is something we just need to parse the data a little bit more and say, well, was it among, male versus female? We're talking about, looking at the race by gender tabs on some of this stuff a little bit to see where he got stronger. But he got stronger too. And I mean, that may not feel that way because of all the focus on Harris, but, Trump is not in a bad position here given all this polling.
It strikes me, at the absolute 30,000 foot level, as we go through these considerations that we're really seeing kind of, this collision or this, this kind of intertwining of short-term and longer-term, deeper kind of structural factors here that, I'd have been frankly shocked had we not seen some improvement in Democratic numbers as a result of the replacement. I think if we had not seen something, I'd have thought there was something wrong with the sample, On the other hand, there are the other things that are just the normal part of the cycle. More people are paying attention. Partisanship is set in, and it's not like there was any reason to expect that there was going to be a big change in the Trump preferences. And all things being equal, we should have expected Trump's numbers to improve as people started paying more attention.
Yeah. It's just that the range for them to improve is so small. And so when we look at those key groups and we look at the trial ballot shift and we look at independents, we look at suburban voters, we look at suburban women voters, we look at college-educated voters, just to see, Harris does better among all these groups that she needed to do significantly better than Biden was. And Trump, for his credit, basically stayed at the same place, which is fine because it ends up with him with a 5-point lead, which is about what he won the state by last time.
Yeah, I think, in political science, there's a conversation right now, sort of a minority, but strongly held opinion and one that gets a lot of play at conferences and things like that, whatever. We had this historic debate. We had this assassination attempt, a Republican naming a vice president, a convention, a replacement of the Democratic incumbent president with another candidate who then had her VP selection and then the convention. And yet we're within a couple of points of where we were at the outset. And therefore, all you're really talking about is movement that essentially amounts to activation of Democrats who are probably going to come home anyway. This is the political science argument. And I would just offer two things. First of all, everybody should kind of know that. That is what, academics say about this sort of stuff. Not everybody, but a lot of people. And one is that, our conversation is informed by the way in which that happens. That the notion that therefore we should dismiss all this stuff speak for my colleagues here as being nonsense. Of course it matters. The way it matters here, my second point would be you had an election in which the entire conversation was about the mental capacity of the sitting president. That was it. It was just dominating the discussion and the conversation. So, yes, but President Biden was down a couple of points. And you look at those numbers, you think, well, we could erase that, but not with that cloud hanging over.
Well, not with that being the conversation.
Yeah, you could not cut through. And that election was always going to be about, where you're trying to fight through the perception that the guy was just too old. So now at least, you're a couple points better, but I think you're significantly better off from the Democratic perspective, both in Texas and nationally, because it's a different conversation. It's about, okay, is Harris really a change candidate? Is she too progressive? All of these issues are allowed to emerge, and all of them, almost by definition, are better than is the president senile, which is not the conversation you want to be having.
And not that it's working, but it also, not that it seems to be working at this point, and we'll see what happens in tonight's debate. I don't think
right.
But it also shifts that very fatal argument to the other side.
Yeah, and this is, I enjoyed this for my own reasons about methodology and, how people think, actually. But, it's surprising when we asked about a bunch of trait questions about, whether strong leaders, knowledgeable, the temperament. First of all, just say, they were surprisingly similar. Just overall in terms of, it wasn't the same Texans ascribing the same traits to them, but in terms of the share of Texans willing to say that Donald Trump or Kamala Harris is knowledgeable, is a strong leader. There was surprisingly it was a pretty narrow gap in most cases, except where it wasn't. And there was one that we repeated, and it was to compare with the last time. It was really to compare Trump with himself, which was too old. Is too old to serve a president in 2025. Nobody thought this about Harris, obviously, and we talked about whether to include the question and methodology, blah blah blah. We'll do that on the After Hours podcast, right? But for Trump, where we can easily make a comparison between what people thought in June and what they think now, it went from 33% of Texans saying he was too old to be president in 2025 to 46%, right? That's a big shift, to your point. Another question we see a huge shift is in voting enthusiasm, where we went from 39% of Democrats saying they were extremely enthusiastic about voting in 2024. This was in June. Jumps up to 52%, so it goes up 13 points, where Republican enthusiasm drops 6 points from 55 to 49. So to Daron's point about what is actually going on here, well, something happened, right? If Biden had stayed in the race, these numbers don't change. The idea that Harris's underlying numbers that Biden's underlying numbers just move in the same direction that Harris's would have is pretty crazy.
Yeah, I think that's
on its face.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Now, what Harris does, and again, it's relevant for Texas, but also nationally, is she takes the age issue off. Not only, are the Democrats not defending on age, now they can attack on age.
Yeah. If that's such a big deal.
Right. Exactly. Hey, we thought it was such a big deal. We replaced our candidate.
Yeah, you guys were right. I'm glad we all agree.
And then the other thing is, what's the other major liability? We're not going to get into an argument about whether Biden should be on Mount Rushmore and he's been underrated, but the approval ratings for the incumbent administration are low. They're around 40. In our poll. Josh will get to this in a second.
No, it's something else I'm thinking for later.
Okay. But it's unclear whether Harris is even necessarily playing a lot of defense on that, because she's not Biden. Yes, it's the Harris-Biden administration, but I think that's something that will probably come into sharper focus. But strangely enough, she's competitive as the change candidate, even though she is running as...
Yeah, I think that will probably be one of the themes of the debate tonight, I would think. At least, you would think that the Trump campaign is going to do everything they can, to, attack and undermine that argument.
Yeah, so, you have an electorate that thinks, boy, these candidates are too old and we're not happy with the direction of the country. So you have a younger candidate who's not necessarily as responsible for the direction of the country, and it just... it allows things to breathe, and it allows maybe somebody like Colin Allred to get some oxygen in a race where otherwise he'd just be smothered, I think.
Yeah, I think
you gave me a great opportunity to do a transition, but I'm not quite ready yet.
Oh, man.
I know, and I appreciate it.
But I was Magic Johnson. I gave you the assist.
I know, and you know what I did?
And you pulled out for a three-pointer.
I just watched it. I watched that pitch sail, and you probably hit the corner, but I'm not going to swing quite yet.
Double bogey.
Look at that. Is that some kind of... I think we just used three different sports metaphors in one 20-second passage, which is, makes me want to stick this pen in my ear.
Yeah, it's a new record.
But I do, because and I've got a good reason for not wanting to swing at that pitch quite yet, because we did do this open-ended issue question. And I thought the results on that were very interesting, because they do align with the conversation in interesting ways, or not. I'd be interested what you guys thought, because in part because we have talked about part of campaigns being about agenda management. We've had this about every other time the three of us are together for a podcast, we talk a little bit about issue publics and things like this. And I thought that the issue results on this were really pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about which candidate trust on the issues.
Yeah, the candidate trust on the issues, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, in some ways it was...
And you're right, that was not the open-ended question.
Yeah.
I'll talk
but
about
the open-ended
one.
question is the background to this in some ways. So.
Yeah. Well, do you want to do that?
Why don't you do the open-endeds and what we got,
we
and
asked
then you
a question,
can go.
just thinking about the election.
We want you to do this.
Yeah.
This is good.
Right.
This is great.
We asked people, open-ended, we should clarify, when we say an open-ended question, the respondents are not presented with response options, right? We're just asking them, tell us what issue you think is, and I think we asked, what are the one or two most important issues you want the presidential candidates to talk about? So, I kind of like what, I think Josh probably did this question, a way to kind of get at this. Yeah, it's a folksy way to kind of ask about, what do you want to hear about, right?
I am known as being pretty folksy.
He's a man of the people. Everybody says that. And we got, the
your
economy.
Rural upbringing.
Yeah, 24%. One quarter voter said the economy. Another 16% said inflation.
I want to say just because the person who coded that, inflation is the basket of things, prices, cost of living.
Yeah.
Inflation is a very specific term that's not being used specifically right now, but it means the way that it's not being used in the non-specific sense,
right.
prices, costs.
So 40%, 2 out of 5 voters said they want the candidates to talk about the economy. And that just absolutely obliterates every other thing on the docket, right? The next highest is immigration, border security at 18%. It's not even half, right? So, and those are the two dominant issues. Then you get into single digits. Nothing else scores double digits. So you have abortion with 7. Now, a small point that I'd make is that you look at the top end issues and you go, man, how do the Republicans not win this election? Because now this is Texas, but the economy is number one, and people's views on the economy are pretty sour still. And immigration, border security, where their views are pretty sour about the performance of the incumbent administration. So, you look at those things and say, you add them all up, it's like 58% are talking about issues that are, Republicans are probably owning. Josh will get that in a minute. But you look at these other issues, and there's a hodgepodge. Abortion, women's rights, 7. Healthcare, 5. Climate change, 4. Democracy, 3. Housing, homelessness, 2. You add them all up. I'm not saying it gets to 58%, but the Democrats have this sort of quilt of issues that if you cobble them all together and you speak to particular constituencies, this I think was one of the underrated stories of 2022. People got enamored with the top-end issues, and the Democrats, I think, did a fabulous job of kind of making the election about smaller sets of issues and kind of stitching them together in a way that made them competitive. So I have an eye on that. I don't think it works as well in Texas just because those issues aren't quite as, they're not quite as robust as they are in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or some of these other states. But they're not. It's not terrible. It's not like the Democrats are totally outmatched on these.
Yeah, I mean, moving between a couple of those comments you said there, I think it's interesting because you're right. I mean, so when we ask sort of, who do you trust more to handle these issues, Harris or Trump, on these key issues, the economy, Trump 50, Harris 40, on inflation prices, Trump 49, Harris 40, on immigration and border security, Trump 53, Harris 36. So I think that would be her lowest rating, and his highest would be on that issue, right? And that makes sense. And I mean, to your point too, I mean, I think one of the things that kind of comes out of that is, how much responsibility does Harris have for the economy, for prices, for the border, and how successful are they at essentially, making her part of at least partially, if not fully responsible for what people are feeling. At the same time, you can also see the extent to which Trump does have some weaknesses. I mean, one thing that's stuck out on this is, on the abortion access question, right? So on who would do better for abortion access, 55% of Texas voters said Harris. Not only it was the highest who picked either candidate on any issue, and Trump only 27%, which is why,
It was the highest on that end, and it was the lowest in terms of Trump's.
He was tied with climate change, but exactly, and that's sort of the point here. I mean, I think what's interesting in some ways is that not only are the issues that are good for Democrats, to your point, climate change, abortion access, healthcare, are they good? What's interesting is that they sort of add up to the Democratic issues, but they're actually also the issues where even Texans give her the benefit of the doubt over him on these issues. So to the extent that Democrats are capable of moving people towards this or micro-targeting, and that's really what it comes down to, micro-targeting especially, and I'll say especially women, on the women's health, access, abortion issue, that is hanging out there. But at the same time, I also feel like this, and you're much more of a campaign guy than I am. If you're trying to educate the electorate, that's a tough one. If you're trying to move people in their focus, that's a tough one because you just sound like you're not actually talking about what people care about.
No, that's true. And that is the catch-22, which is shifting the focus possibly at the expense of making voters think that you're connected to their real issues. I do think one of the things that shifted with Harris in the race as opposed to Biden is earlier on, Trump's advantage over Biden on these issues like inflation and prices, on border security, was on the order of 30, 35 points. Now, it's still huge on border security, but on the economic issues, it's like 8 to 10.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the Democratic advantage on these sort of smaller bore issues has expanded. So, she doesn't have they're not as large a percentage of people who hold those issues to be top, but she's killing it with those groups. And that sort of shrinks the overall Republican advantage.
And I think a lot of that, I think a lot of that probably accrues to the groups that Democrats were quote unquote supposed to be doing well with, back in June, and they weren't, and so I wonder, and this is kind of in between the 2 points you're making, right? And that on the one hand, the campaign got them there. On the other hand, a quality campaign from the beginning, they would have been there already, probably, right?
Well, the other thing I kind of know, and I thought that's why I wanted to talk about that was all that stuff you guys were talking about. I also think independents on the issue stuff among independents was also pretty interesting in that Trump enjoys, more trust among independents on economy, inflation, immigration, and the border, but more independents, of course, by virtue of who they are, fewer independents have views of that. More of them, just say, I don't know who I trust on this. Trump has kind of single-digit leads on economy, inflation, immigration, border security. Harris has a really big lead in, an artifact of the larger lead overall, but 59-18 among true independents on abortion. And again, do the Democrats have the wherewithal? Is it too much of a stretch in the way that you guys are talking about? But it just seems like such a winning issue for Democrats if they talk about it the right way.
I'm curious,
and they can move it up. And
I'm curious what Daron thinks about this because on the one hand, I feel pretty confident in the observation that economic attitudes, generally dominate the context under which people vote. And incumbency clearly matters. At the same time, it's hard for me to imagine how Trump takes a position on abortion that either doesn't, accelerate or reinforce mobilization advantages that Harris is going to try to, really use. Or the flip side of this is, say something more moderate that actually has a demobilizing effect on, kind of, again, we're talking about margins here, but key parts of his coalition as well.
Yeah, I actually think he's, kind of reading a classic literature and political sciences, issue ownership literature, which is associated with John Petrosic, who's formerly UCLA, or Budge and Farley, who did this in a comparative concept. And their argument was simply that parties have higher credibility on certain issues, right? It's more complex than that, but that's kind of the idea. And therefore, campaigns are about agenda control. If we were to tell you today the election's going to be about abortion and climate change, we can pretty much predict who's going to win. If it's about crime and it's about border security, we can pretty much tell you who's going to win. The question then for a campaign becomes, what do you do with an issue that's obviously important? You can't not talk about it. How do you neutralize it? And I think the interesting thing is that the task for the Democrats is a little easier on the economy because no one owns the economy. It's a pure performance issue, right? So, the key is to make it prospective, right? Where are we going? The key is to, in Harris's case, sort of distance herself a little bit from what's going on. Just talk about future, what she's going to do, and turn it into a question about tax cuts for millionaires or something, right? To pivot it or to frame the economy issue slightly differently. Trump has tried this. He's tried to neutralize abortion. He's tried to, and he has done it stunningly because he's never doing this. He's done exactly what political consultants would tell him to do on the issue, which is to basically say, I would veto a national ban. I would probably veto some of these state things if I were the governor, which I'm not. But I'm happy that it's in the hands of these different places where they can make the rules according to preferences of their own constituencies, which I think all of us in a meeting in June would have said, yes, Mr. Former President, that's the right thing to do. And I don't think it's worked at all. Now part of that is people don't believe him.
Yeah.
And I think part of it, and to be candid, Harris has lied about what Trump has said. She said he will do this, and he's said quite the opposite. Now, I'm not saying she's wrong because he's notoriously kind of unreliable about what he would or wouldn't do, but it's clearly not what he has said. Yeah. But that's the trouble when you're fighting on the other person's turf. Is that you're in a do you really want to be in a debate about who's credible on abortion?
Yeah, I mean, because on this, whether Harris is lying, shading the truth, cherry picking his comments, however you want to put that. He's going to have a hard, it's just impossible to my mind, political science or no political science, for him to move away from the credit he's taken for the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade. And that's just going to be hard to get away from.
That's how he's tried to thread it, right? He's tried to say, I'm happy with the court. I like my judges. This was a bad law.
Glad the states are figuring it out.
But I wouldn't, I personally, which by the way is not to defend Trump, but it's an intellectually very defensible position. But intellectually defensible positions don't work in campaigns a lot of the time.
Yeah, and intellectually defensible, but also not tonally consistent with
Correct.
the way that he has approached that issue. He was approaching that issue when he was president.
No, and I've mentioned this before, I think, but I think the key with the abortion issue too is I think it's a marker issue for Republican insensitivity or antipathy towards women and women's rights and women's issues.
And that's
and so it's the issue manifestation of a broader feel, and he's fighting against that feel. And plus, Josh is not of this generation, but Jim and I are of a generation where Roe was it was just the issue defining women's rights.
Yeah.
And so for a certain generation of women, it still has that resonance.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
And that's where the legal threading of the needle, or it's legally logical for me to say, really what I wanted all along was for the states to decide. It's not going to pass the sniff test very well, I don't think. Or it creates a rhetorical opening that I don't think he can close.
Well, I think from a campaign point of view, the problem too is I have limited time and bandwidth to articulate messages. How much time and bandwidth do I want to spend on abortion? Right. Because it's a complicated position he's articulating, and every second he's doing that, he's not talking about inflation and the border and crime and the set of issues he's
where he wants to be,
and also
24/7,
and everything that he's saying about the issue is getting parsed against everything that he's already said about the issue, and then
and frankly, a media that's hostile to him generally, and in particular on this issue.
Yeah, and he's hostile to them too. So,
no, I'm not.
There's a lot of hostility to go around.
Yeah, I'm not defending. I'm just saying that that's the reality. Trying to communicating subtlety to a press that's not.
Well, there's also a good conversation to be had, and we can't necessarily have it today about campaigns' hostility towards the press.
Yeah. It's really good.
and vice versa.
I'm writing a paper on this. I would recommend Bruce Mellman, a Democratic consultant, has these. I think he calls it 6-Chart Sunday.
Yeah,
where he puts out these data-driven charts. And he had this very nice kind of breakdown, the difference between the Harris and the Biden campaigns. And the very last point was, they're holding similar events. And for Biden, it was sort of scripted teleprompter events with limited media. And for Harris, it's scripted teleprompter events with no media. And it's a complaint that's occurred. I think there was an article in The Atlantic on this same subject, basically saying that it's the one bad thing that the Harris campaign has done is bringing the Biden people on with the same media strategy. That is a belief that the media is, that there's antipathy on the part of the media towards them, and therefore they don't want to do any. It's not that they don't like the media, they don't trust the media, they don't think they need the media. And so, to Jim, at your point, there's a real long conversation about the relationship between public and elected officials and the news media in the United States, because. We're in an experiment right now about whether you can completely ignore them. And I'm not ragging on Harris. Because clearly the Trump campaign isn't interested in doing interviews with anybody but Hannity or.
There's a couple of different things there. There's like the different forms of that hostility towards the media and how it's expressed. Because I don't know as you're working on this what you're finding, but it became pretty clear, it seems to me, that the press was very unhappy with the Biden strategy of very few press conferences, limiting exposure. What in retrospect I think one can pretty plausibly argue was trying to keep him under wraps.
Right.
And then when he made the mistake, it validated that objection, and made the coverage just brutal.
Right.
I mean, look, it was going to be brutal anyway after the debate. But I mean, there was a lot of pent up frustration that got expressed, and now it's getting transferred to some degree into this what the Harris strategy is now, and the way that you kind of spun that out.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting dynamic. And, part of it is kind of an elite-driven strategy question, but there's also this overall arc, I think, in which, people are saying, why, I don't give a shit if Peter Baker thinks I'm not having enough press conferences. When I can go and, if you're the Trump guys and you're upset because they don't like you for some other reason, well, you're just going to go talk to Joe Rogan or whoever anyway.
Or put it on social media yourself.
Yeah, put it on social media yourself. And I think the Harris campaign is toying with that. I mean, I think they've not executed it quite yet, but I will not be surprised if we're going to see Harris on The View and all this other kind of stuff.
Well, right, but it goes from Harris back to Biden, but back to Hillary Clinton. And the Clintons,
actually,
strained relationship with them. Right.
I mean, talk to the Obama administration people about, their relationship with the press. Well, this not a lot of love.
Right. This is a question. I mean, you've seen it come. Matt Taibbi raised it. The notion that you have to go through the Guardians here is really coming under fire. I mean, we've done some work with people in Texas about whether it's worth it, the time and energy they spend responding to press inquiries. Does it affect the kind of coverage you get, and then does the kind of coverage you get affect public opinion? So it's this sort of two separate relationships, right?
And which press entities.
Right, because elected officials spend a lot of time and energy responding to media inquiries, and there is this interesting, Jim, as you said, in a polarized world where you're speaking to more segmented electorates, and when there are alternative means of communicating with them, the role of the media has really come under question. It's an important academic.
One thing that I want to insert into that, and I'll be quick, is just, but also in a polarized world in which the political systems are so ineffective, the incentive to go out and take ownership over policy that most likely will never happen seems to be pretty low. I mean, this is kind of my whole thing overall. I mean, in the longer arc, the argument that I'm sort of testing is the fact that, part of what allowed Trump the way to enter in is the fact that we expect our presidential candidates to meet with everybody and have a policy for everything. And good luck. It doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican or whatever. The issue is you're not going to get that bill passed. I'm really only interested, honestly.
Well, and also I don't know how self-conscious they are about it, but I mean, given that as the backdrop right now, I mean, I think candidates could be forgiven for going, you know what? Yeah, I'm not going to have a well fleshed out position on every policy under the sun, and what's the kabuki theater of saying, aha, you don't have any policy?
Well, and again, Trump benefited from this. I mean, this is the thing. And when I say he benefited from this, I mean, he's benefiting from it right now because people are saying, well, Harris needs to have this detailed policy proposal on everything. And it's really? Why? Trump doesn't unless you want to take Project 2025, which I'm not, and just say, so what? But the other side of this is I think Trump's, success in some ways at painting all politicians as liars is because he can point to every single presidential candidate who's ever run for the office in the modern era, at least, and say, how much of that stuff did they really get done? Yeah.
Well, but remember, I do think it's important to recognize the context right now. It's particularly interesting right now because you have a candidate who has just emerged.
Yeah.
Who had a detailed set of policy positions as recently as 2019, and who we think has moved off of those policy positions. But we're not sure about that. And the press is screaming bloody murder because they think they ought to be able to, kind of help sort this out. And I think, like Josh is saying, I think without putting words in your mouth, that the Harris campaign is I'm not so sure we have to do that.
Yeah.
And that's very interesting. I mean, I have some views of that as a citizen and as a voter, but from a campaign point of view, this is an interesting test. I'm not sure she's going to have to do this, but we'll see.
I hate to be normative, and we should move on to the Senate race. But I mean, there is something to my mind, just having watched all this. It's I think you can kind of look at these two candidates, and the question becomes, if a bill came to either of their desks that would be a 6-week nationwide abortion ban, regardless of what anybody said, what do you think each of them would do? Would they sign it or would they veto it? If a climate bill came up, if a gun bill came up, if a tax bill came up that increased the taxes on corporations and the wealthy, or a tax bill that gave more broader-based cuts, or whatever you want to describe it, I think, honestly, in America today, like I think, just a general directional sense of where these people are going to go is probably about maybe the most valuable thing that people could have, because the rest of it is nonsense. They're not going to, the spending bill is not going to be passed as they propose it. None of the bills they put forward are going to be passed, or even taken up in most cases. And to the extent that legislation has like passed in recent years under Biden, a lot of that was, I think, in some ways, his willingness and ability to like step out of the way and not make himself a poison pill. Anyway,
I'm not sure.
That's that's a side.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to get back off.
Yeah, that was a little ranty.
Sorry, guys.
But hey, I was just thinking this feels a little more like lunch than the podcast.
Well, we're close.
But that's fine. Hardly the first podcast to sound like a lunch conversation. But let's talk a little bit about the Senate race before we get out of here.
To jump into it? All right.
Jump into it, Chuck.
So in the race, Cruz is still leading Allred 44-36, with the Libertarian Brown at 2. 4% say they are going to vote for someone else, and 14% are undecided. So notably, a lot more undecided voters at this point in that race, reflecting to a large extent probably Allred's, lower name ID. One of the things that I thought was notable about this was if we look back to December when we started looking at this trial ballot, Cruz is leading by 16 in December, 14 in February, 13 in April, 11 in June, and 8 as of August. His numbers, Cruz's, in the trial ballot have remained pretty static, 43, 46, 46, 45, 44, where Allred's has gone from 27 and back in December and climbed up to 36. This is almost entirely Democrats. I mean, just to be clear, I mean, it's interesting looking at this. In August of 23, 34% of Democrats had a favorable view of Colin Allred, 11 had an unfavorable. In August of 24, a year later, 69 have a favorable view, 7 have an unfavorable view. So he's just climbing on up. The couple areas of, again, I think Cruz is still comfortable in this race. He's obviously been working very, very hard and sees this race, a little bit differently than he did his last. But, independents might still be a bit of an issue here, right? If we look at the last two surveys, Cruz was leading among independents in both. In the last one, he was up 33-20. And this one, Allred is leading 34-27. When we look at the favorability numbers, again, Allred 30-22, fave, unfave, and Cruz is 23-55. And this has kind of been something that's hung around Cruz's neck, especially among independents, for quite a while. And it's important to say that just because an independent doesn't like a particular candidate or doesn't like the current governing party, right, doesn't mean that they're ready to jump on board with the other party. I think that's important. Republicans are the object of evaluation much more here because they hold all the offices. So there is that. But nonetheless, if you're going to cut into that lead, that's going to be a part of it. I'll say, Allred is doing the work. I mean, I'll just make one more comment about the Allred race and looking at these numbers. To the extent there were a lot of articles sort of questioning Allred's strategy, commitment, whatever, throughout the summer, or I think his numbers look fine. I think you look at kind of where O'Rourke was throughout his races, and O'Rourke was, meteoric, and also was during the Trump midterms. Allred's doing a pretty fine job and seems to have benefited in a lot of the same ways that Harris had kind of from the summer. And so,
it seems to me there's two things I really noticed about that along those lines. Is one, this race has been very slow to develop, right? I mean, just overall, right? And I think, that's contributing to some degree to the variability we're seeing in the polling, although I think there's a lot of methodology involved in why we're seeing so much variability. We can or cannot circle back to that. The other thing that I'm really sort of, interested in here, if you look at that favorability number you just quoted on Allred, you look at Democrats in the trial ballots, depending on what you want to use as an indicator, you've got, roughly about a fifth of Democrats still not kind of weighing in on this and committing to Allred. And I think, that you can interpret that positively or negatively, or, figure out what the balance between the two is, right? I mean, on one hand, you got to interpret that as room to grow, given that the chances of, Ted Cruz getting, given his history and his image.
And how Democrats feel about him.
And that's what I was saying, getting a big chunk of this Democratic vote, pretty small. On the other hand, we're not talking about March numbers anymore, or even June numbers in terms of that big a chunk of Democrats sort of not being on board and not being attentive to the race. I mean, I think in the last, and to set you up, Daron, I think at the last podcast, we were in the same position. We talked about all this other stuff and we're jamming in the Cruz all red race at the end. I think you kind of said, look, as part of your balance, if you're Ted Cruz and you're running a third time and, you're still in the mid 40s and you haven't hit 50, if you're calling all red looking at that, you're thinking that's, not a bad indicator for us.
Yeah. I mean, I hate to continue to kind of articulate that. Well, if I were in the all red campaign, I would see it positively. And if I were in the Cruz campaign, I'd see this positively. But I would. The overall numbers is 44-36. Now, it's kind of stunning in a Senate race this late. We're in September, Jim, as you mentioned, and we've got essentially 20% who are either other or haven't decided. That's your 1 out of 5.
Yeah.
72% of Democrats have committed to Aldred. Only 82% of Republicans have committed to Cruz right now, which is another number I find just kind of incomprehensible. You look at younger voters, and I'm not going to. It's difficult to poll younger voters. They're always a little volatile. So they're always a little tricky. But right now, Ted Cruz at 37% with younger voters, those under 30. Well, that's 9 points better than all because we're getting 26 and the 35, 37% of those under 30 say they're either voting for third party or they don't have an opinion. So this race just has not come into focus yet. So if I'm already, at least Cruz isn't running away from me. I'm, 8 points down. He's under 50%. And I've got my money.
You're chipping.
Yeah. I'm going to start, getting well known. And if I, go from 72% to 90% with Democrats and hold my share of independents, maybe I make this hold this race
at
5 points and, then who knows what happens, right? Now, if I'm Cruz, though, on the other hand, the committed vote, if you look at the committed vote right now, which is just, Cruz over Cruz plus Allred, right? He's at 55%. 55% is a tough number, even with, a fifth of the electorate still kind of hanging out there, right? And it's unclear exactly what the issue basis is where Allred kind of undoes that. Cruz is tied with Hispanics, basically. He's leading with younger voters. And here's where I would really be a little disturbed. He's getting killed with seniors. He's killing Allred with seniors. He's 18 points up with seniors. And one thing we do know about elections is midterms even more than presidential, but those people vote.
Let's say we don't know who of those under 30 are going to show up. We know that most of those people over 65 are showing up.
Right. So the kind of the really reliable portions of the elect. Look at strong Republicans 89-1 for Cruz, strong Democrats 80-6 for Allred. There's a little bit of growth potential there for Allred, but it's not clear to me this race proportionally isn't a 55-45 race kind of moving forward. I mean that's the default. And the question is, can Allred alter that composition? Can he win 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 4 of the remaining voters, which then pulls it into now it's a contest and who knows what happens, right? But I'm looking at that group and I'm thinking they probably split 50-50, and that won't get it done. But
before we go to our sort of wild card portion of the show, I want to with you in here, Daron, and we've had this there's this discussion that it's come up a couple times in this conversation. This from the political science kind of this whole notion of our people coming home. What's, the continuity versus change thing? I mean, I've kind of said a couple times, and I'm curious whether you guys would agree with this or not, that, and this is not, a lot of people have said this, so I'm not like, this is my idea, I'm workshopping, but it seems fair to me to look at these numbers and kind of say, when we were having this conversation in June, after the June poll, it was looking like if you looked at the trend in presidential ballot returns, that Biden's weakness was kind of bending the curve back up, the trend line up again. In other words, what we've all talked about in talking to people, Romney wins by 12, in 2012, Trump wins by, a little less than 9 in 2016 in Texas, then Trump wins by a little less than 6, 5 3/4. And, bare minimum trend, you're beginning to expect that, if it's a 3 to 5 point race this time, that's what we might expect at the top of the ballot. Harris seems to have bent that curve back towards the more normal direction. But to me, the question is how much? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we've another way of putting
it's the
this
most
would be,
obvious,
Yeah, but what's the high end versus the low end kind of, Democratic or Republican, depending on our perspective, vote total here? And I think we've gone from, when Jim, you and I started this, we'd have probably said something like, 18 points on the high end for the Republicans down to like 8, right? That 10-point
actually, when we
bandwidth, right?
started, probably not even that far down, probably more like 10 or 12.
Right. And now I think we're down to, 15-3 or 13-3 if we wanted to keep it at 10, right? So the best Democrat, high quality candidate like Beto O'Rourke in a good Democratic year can get to within a couple points.
And that's between 2018, right? That's Cruz.
Well, that's a good Democratic year.
That's Cruz to Abbott, basically.
Right. Exactly. And whereas, if the Democrats insist on running a candidate that's not going to spend any money or do a campaign or get known, then you get Abbott numbers, basically, 13 point. I think, has that moved in the last 4 or 5 years? I don't think it has. And I think that might, and we could differ on this. And I think the reason it hasn't is that the younger people and Hispanic voters who are becoming a larger portion of the population that we thought would continue to bend that curve, I think they basically come in at roughly 50-50. So they're not moving it back, but I don't think they're contributing.
So if I'm reading that, just to oversimplify, you're saying we shouldn't expect the trend line to continue downwards. It's maybe plateaued.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, those segments are so. I think the reality is, I guess my end point would be the parties have done such a crummy job of speaking to those voting segments, Republicans and Democrats. And until one of the parties, maybe both, hopefully both, but one of the parties figures out, that these are important segments of the electorate, and you really can't keep articulating the politics of the 1930s and expecting them to respond. I think you're going to continue to have this sort of oddness. I think what might occur is that the band might increase. That is to say, we've been talking about a 10-point band. It's possible you could see like a 15-point band where a really good Democrat could break through, whereas a really good Republican could push it upwards back to 15.
Okay, we're getting past the hour mark, so I'm gonna go and say let's do the dealer's choice. Oh, sorry, but you can go first since you want to talk. How's that?
Well, okay.
What else in the poll did you really like? What stuck out that we haven't talked about?
I'll just start something kind of on the side that was sort of interesting. There's a lot of talk about Biden's exit, and I think there was some national polling on this that sort of saw an uptick in his approval numbers. And I'll just say right now, none of that happened in Texas. His approval numbers stayed exactly where they were before the June debate. Democrats, independents, Republicans don't like him, et cetera. Democrats are fine, So they didn't move. And I thought that was kind of interesting. And the context of that was we did ask a lot of questions about his decision to exit it. And overwhelmingly, the response was that it was the right move, that he should have exited. Democrats more so than Republicans. I mean, nearly 80, 90% of Democrats, depending on what the question was, essentially took the affirmative that Harris is a stronger candidate. Biden should have exited. Good stuff.
And also, just we also had the other piece of that is, and he shouldn't, he shouldn't have to leave office.
Yeah, he should finish his term. And that was, so that's sort of floating around there. It's a little bit skewed everything. It's one of those, we're not going to ask those again. They're not trend questions, but we thought we wanted to look into it and see whether there was any, sour grapes. I mean, that was still some of the talk, I think, as we're writing this.
in terms of the behind the scenes stuff a little bit, sometimes, we have these discussions about, well, we kind of think we know what the answer is going to be, but, better to ask.
Yeah. Well, it's fun. It's especially fun when you don't know. I mean, to some extent on that. And it was, to the extent that there were loud voices on both Republicans and Democrats sort of, lobbing some criticisms towards the whole thing. We did want to get a sense of whether that was widespread. And the answer was no.
Yeah.
It just wasn't. So,
Daron, how about you?
Josh and Jim probably asked a series of really interesting questions about different potential problems with the 2024 election and how serious people thought these problems would be. Things like secrecy of the ballot, people voting multiple times, voting machines being hacked, foreign governments are bad, all this stuff. Like, how concerned are you? And far and away, it wasn't even close. The top answer was misinformation spread on social media. And when I say not even close, 57% of Texans said that was an extremely serious issue. The next highest voting problem would be votes being counted inaccurately, 39%. 57 to 39. If you add up extremely and somewhat serious 83% think that misinformation spread on social media is a serious problem. So I thought that was a really interesting finding and one that I'm sure we'll talk about a lot in future surveys.
Yeah, I actually moderated a panel on disinformation at the Tribune Festival Sunday. It was at 4:00, and we did not get 70-something% of the conference attendees to come to my panel, but with somebody, with Sasha Eisenberg and Ellen Rosenblum, who's the AG of Colorado. But the people that were there were very interested and, very serious about this. I thought both of those things were actually pretty interesting and worth noting. To presage, a discussion that will come, amidst all of the national politics that we did here, we had a result in which we asked people, to assess, what might be, what was important in the realm of public education, essentially.
Yeah, public education priority.
Yeah, what should be the priority when the legislature comes back? And obviously, this is speaking to the churn that is resulted from vouchers. And the question was, has all the attention to vouchers among political elites in the state? To my mind, how much has that seeped down among the electorate? And at least in terms of this indication, not much indication that this is something that people are seeing as a real driver of what should be happening in public education policy. That does not discount, in the past when we've asked and we've seen support for vouchers or some kind of choice system kind of move into plurality, majority territory. But in terms of how it's prioritized in the policy process, we're just not seeing any movement in that. We'll talk in more detail about that later on. But, as a state thing, that really stood out to me. And also the fact that, that issue has kind of poked its head up in national politics even. I think, one of the many considerations of Josh Shapiro joining the ticket or not joining the ticket was that he had taken, what I would classify as a politically pragmatic position on vouchers in Pennsylvania. And I think that, there was significant pushback among teachers groups, education groups in Democratic circles on that. I don't think it was the main thing, but it is out there floating around in national politics too. With that, Daron, Josh, thank you so much. As always, a lot of fun. Thanks very much to our crew here in the audio studio, in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. All the data we've talked about and much, much more at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. If you happen to listen to this before the debate, Josh and I gathered up a bunch of data, much of which we talked about here today, relevant to the position of Biden, Harris in a lot of different ways.
Trump.
I'm sorry, and Trump, but Trump, Harris in the election. Oh, there's some on Biden in there too.
Yeah.
So, you might want to look at that. That'll be in the blog section. And if, you listen to this after the debate, you can look and see if any of that was helpful, if we picked it well. So especially thank you all for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.